everyone and welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, my name is Caitlin and I upload a whole bunch of different types of videos on this channel, mainly surrounding true crime and psychological cases, as well as a little bit of fashion and lifestyle sprinkled in where I can. So for today's video we're going to be discussing the very mysterious case of a man named Benjamin Kyle. And very briefly before I get into it, this story is absolutely fascinating. Basically it's about a man who is discovered with no recollection of who he is or what had happened to him and what his life was before being discovered, and it's kind of all about the journey of searching for this man's real identity. So it really is a fascinating mystery. It's a little bit different. It's not like a true crime case that I typically do on this channel, but I just definitely thought, since it piqued my interest so much, I thought you guys might kind of find it interesting to hear about this case as well. So yeah, with that being said, I'm just going to get straight on with the video. The case of Benjamin Kyle all begins on August the 31st in the year of 2004 at a Burger King in Richmond Hill in Georgia. An employee working at the Burger King had headed out to the back of the restaurant when he'd spotted something extremely unusual in front of the rubbish bins. Lying on the ground was an unconscious man. He wasn't wearing any clothes and it had been clear that he'd been quite badly sunburnt as well as sweating heavily. The employee had immediately panicked and screamed loudly, as I'm sure you can imagine anyone would in that situation, and they ran back into the restaurant to alert help for their strange finding. When law enforcement officers had arrived on the scene, they'd found a conscious but particularly disoriented man who didn't seem to have any recollection of where he was and how he got there. The initial police report had stated that the officers had arrived at the scene and found a vagrant sleeping on the ground. This man, however, was picked up by an ambulance and taken to the St. Joseph's Hospital in Savannah on that same day. Despite their active attempts and the fact that the man himself was in and out of consciousness, officials were unable to obtain a formal name from the individual, and so he was simply admitted into the hospital under the name Burger King Doe. This man's physical state hadn't really displayed anything particularly drastic, aside from a rash that had appeared to have come about as a result of extreme sun exposure, as well as him having cataracts that were actually causing him some serious and extensive damage to his eyesight. He was described as being a Caucasian male in his mid-50s who appeared to be in particularly good health. The hospital staff carried out blood tests in order to determine whether there was any evidence of drugs or alcohol in his system in the previous few days. However, all of these tests had come back negative. A major tell in his appearance though had been his kind of superficial appearance. He had a noticeably grown out beard and a lot of dirt on his hands and under his fingernails, which led officials to come up with the conclusion that he had been living on the streets for a short while leading up to this point. Scans in the hospital displayed there being 3 small indents or kind of depressions on 3 different areas of his skull, a few scars on his neck, another one on his left arm, but aside from this there didn't really seem to be anything wrong with the man physically. However, when he was conscious, it became overtly clear that there was some extensive psychological damage as a result of whatever it had been that he'd been living through. He refused to speak to anyone and made no sound whatsoever, as well as refusing any food that was put in front of him. He made a point of keeping his eyes closed as much as possible, and he seemed rather subdued whenever anything was going on. However, if any of the hospital staff who were attending to him had attempted to touch his chest, he would react particularly violently and he'd start to thrash out and throw his arms and his legs about at them to try and kind of get them away in as an aggressive manner as possible. And it took a number of days for there to be any change in his behaviour, but then one day he chose to eat some ice chips. Something in him had changed, and he suddenly told the attending staff where he had come from. He told them that he'd been living in the woods for the last 17 years. The attending nurse at the time had asked him what his name was since he'd had this sudden spur of memory, and he just responded with, "They call me BK around here." She corrected him and prompted for his real name, but he once again said BK, "But you're getting me confused." And then he fell silent once again. After being in the hospital for 8 days, he suddenly started showing aggressive behaviour once again. He shouted at the attending nurses and swearing at them while calling them beasts and demons. He would lash out at them again if they tried to get close to him, and some nurses even reported him spitting at them while they were trying to help calm him. The man then made a request to speak to a priest immediately, which, when the staff delivered on the request, ended very badly too. He immediately accused the priest of being an imposter and called everyone in the hospital devil. As a result of these strange behaviours, hospital staff decided that it was kind of the most tactful decision to carry out kind of a minor psychological test on the man, following which the doctors actually diagnosed him as having catatonic schizophrenia. They prescribed him with a powerful and effective antipsychotic called Haldol in an attempt to curb his outbursts. He was then transferred out of this hospital and then to a psychological ward in another hospital in the area, and while he was here, professionals continued to question him daily about his identity. He claimed that he couldn't remember his name or where he was living at the time, and he couldn't explain how he ended up anywhere near the area. He told them that he had this sneaking suspicion that he was originally from Indianapolis and that he had 3 brothers, but he couldn't provide any further details as to what any of them looked like or what any of their names were. As they conversed further, the man came to realise that he wasn't able to remember or picture anyone in his life. In fact, he only had a few select memories that he could actually recall. One of these was the inside of an old movie theatre, a road going down through a cornfield, as well as select few streets in a city that he claimed to believe was Denver. He claimed that he could, however, remember very vividly that his birthday was August the 29th, 1948. At the time, the attending doctor in charge of examining his psychological state had reported having a strong suspicion that the man was actually faking having amnesia. He also reported that the man seemed too consciously aware to be a suffering schizophrenic, as this was the diagnosis from the previous hospital, and it was also clear that his ability to recall and remember facts not relating to his personal life was completely intact, and so it struck him as extremely strange that he would only be unable to recall facts when it applied to his personal information or background. Feigning amnesia was not an uncommon finding in individuals who were attempting to kind of start a new life and start afresh, or if they're running from something in their past, they would feign this amnesia to act like they didn't know what they were running from, but they wanted to start a new life under a new identity somewhere. This doctor had, however, been the only person to believe this, as everyone else attending to him in the hospital were absolutely convinced that he was actually suffering. 4 months after his discovery in the start of 2005, he was transferred to J.C. Lewis Primary Healthcare Centre in downtown Savannah. This served as a shelter for individuals living on the streets, as after remaining in care for the first few months, he hadn't really shown any more frustrated outbursts. His psychological state didn't seem to be deteriorating, so he seemed as though he didn't really need to be under the full-time care of a hospital. And while staying at the centre, he made it clear to the owner of the centre that he no longer liked everyone calling him BK, and that he had a feeling that his real name was Benjamin, but Benjamin was spelt with 2 A's. Since he had no recollection of what he believed his last name was, he chose the name Kyle, as this was fitting with the BK nickname that he had adopted. While staying at the centre, his good behaviour and quite calm demeanour meant that he very quickly built close relationships with a lot of the nurses. Each of the nurses looking after him had individually attempted to aid the recovery of his memory by kind of engaging him in conversations about his past in hopes of one day one of their questions possibly prompting something. They recalled him being particularly cognitively coherent and spent much of his time reading through books in the library store that they'd had in the centre, so he seemed very cognitively aware. He was also a particular favourite of many of the nurses and staff working there, as he would often be the first to volunteer himself to help out with many of the tasks that were needed in day-to-day life, like changing the beds and cleaning the rooms. Many people there considered him to essentially be a member of staff at the shelter, simply because he always seemed to be doing something to help out with the day-to-day running of the centre, and he seemed to just like keeping himself busy. And then, before long, he was considered an essential member within the actual centre, to the point where he even had his own set of keys to absolutely everything in the building. He found himself some clothing from a donation pile that he pieced together and wore as a uniform every single day, and he became the go-to guy for many of the tasks that needed doing within the shelter. Benjamin was a resident here for around 2 years when a nurse named Catherine Slater began her employment. She primarily worked night shifts in the centre, and the pair began to bond, as he himself would spend many of his nights working up late and helping out with different tasks around the building, so they kind of just bonded over working very similar hours. Catherine was middle-aged, and she was known to be very, very warm and very welcoming to everyone working and living there, and before long she'd promised herself that for Benjamin's sake she would be the one to help him remember who he was. When they'd first met, she'd immediately taken a liking to him. He just seemed like a very kind man. She recalled him having a lot of extensive knowledge on equipment, in particular kitchen equipment, which is very interesting, and that will pop up again later on in the case. She wasn't entirely sure at this point that she believed he had amnesia, but she empathised with him for now, being so isolated from his life and everyone in it and not really knowing who you are. So their relationship hadn't been romantic in nature, but she had felt for this quiet and thoughtful man who seemed very happy in his own company. And Catherine convinced herself that this task to find his true identity wouldn't be that difficult, as everyone has to come from somewhere. So she predicted that within 6 months they'd be able to figure out who he really was. However, this wasn't the case, and she continued to prompt the recall of his real name for years. She spent hours searching through missing persons databases online and sharing his picture on different message boards in hopes of someone having some sense of familiarity, but she had no luck. She wasn't alone in the search. Countless law enforcement members, the FBI, local journalists, and even more people came and went with hopes of finding out who he was, to no avail. When Catherine had attempted to continue her search by contacting the police firsthand, she'd been shocked to discover that the local police involved in Benjaman's discovery had never actually formally opened a criminal case. According to her, this had struck her as immediately strange simply because of the way in which he was discovered. So she believed that it seemed like a likely scenario that at some point prior to his discovery that he had been attacked and he'd had his clothes stolen before being left in the middle of nowhere. But this assumption of hers was very quickly argued by law enforcement when they explained to her that none of the evidence that they'd collected from the initial case during his discovery suggested any evidence of there being an assault or another person being involved in any way. What seemed to shock people the most was that they were not only unable to gain a full name from this man, but no one was able to figure out where he had come from or anyone that had been looking for him. It was as though he had no identity prior to being found, as there seemed to be absolutely no record of this man's previous life. His face was posted on TV shows and newspapers and websites that racked up millions of views over the years since his discovery, and yet still no one recognised the man as being someone that they knew. And he remained unidentified, living under the name Benjamin Kyle after being found behind a Burger King restaurant unconscious. Whether he was genuinely suffering from a bout of amnesia as a result of trauma that he'd experienced, or whether he was simply faking it, either way, there still seemed to be little to no record of the man existing at all. So the FBI decided to collect Benjaman's fingerprints and include them in a national database that they held, and they included his photograph on a missing persons page, which they had previously not done simply because, yes, his true identity was still missing, but the man himself was not. Neither of these acts revealed any new information, and even once Interpol, law enforcement in Canada, and even the US Marshal Service, they had a copy of the information of the case to determine whether or not he'd possibly been someone in witness protection. Nothing came about. He was ultimately listed in the FBI database as an unidentified living person. They had actually considered the possibility of him already being in the database but stored under another name, and since there was at any moment at that point around 80,000 active open cases at any point, it just seemed like a difficult task to be able to determine whether this was or wasn't the case. A woman named Bo Preston had been working on the search in the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. She'd spent close to a year examining every person in the database that matched the man's description, dating back to the 1970s, with there being around 350 in total. And over this period, there were multiple potential identifications, but none of them being ever successfully confirmed. 3 years since the discovery of this mystery man had occurred, Catherine Slater still remained adamant on obtaining his true identity. She ultimately decided that she wanted to contact multiple larger media outlets to keep pushing forward, including the Savannah Morning News, and before long the story was spread across news channels around the whole country. The media dubbed him many names, including the Nowhere Man and the Living John Doe, since it really was a very captivating and unusual story. The question still remained on people's minds though: was he holding back more information than he was letting on? Around this time, Dr. Phil and the show's producers had wanted to dedicate an entire episode to him and his story, but before they could do so, they wanted to send in professionals to kind of vet the man to make sure that he wasn't a fake, as I'm pretty sure this is kind of just standard procedure in these sort of cases. The producers placed a man named Harold Copus on the case, and he was an ex-FBI agent turned private detective. For months he dedicated his efforts to interviewing him and people involved in his discovery, and ultimately he told the producers of the show that he was around 90% sure that Benjamin was in fact telling the truth. The show was then taped in October of 2008, and once again they held out hope that this show would reach someone who hadn't already been reached and they'd be able to provide an identity. And then in 2009, a woman named Colleen Fitzpatrick got into contact with Catherine Slater. This woman had devoted her time to being a genealogical detective, meaning that she had become an expert in using DNA databases and public records to trace back an individual's family background. She was extremely talented in the field, and she'd worked on a number of high-profile cases, including providing an identity for a previously misidentified child that was found on the wreckage of the Titanic. Benjamin himself at this time had been facing some troubles as a result of the lack of a true identity, namely his inability to get himself a new social security number, as he would have technically already been given one. He was struggling to find work or claim benefits as a result, and aside from this, certain memories of his previous life seemed to gradually make themselves clear to him without any context. He was able to narrow down that all of his memories that he could remember all came from Colorado between the mid-1970s and the mid-1980s, including watching the 1976 release of the film Car Wash in Denver and being in Boulder just before the Big Thompson flood in that same year. Fitzpatrick's search was narrowed down in terms of location thanks to these memories, and one of her next port of calls was to contact the DMV in Georgia and Indiana as a means of them running a facial recognition search through their database of driver's licenses. He had told her that he was absolutely sure of his birthday being August the 29th, 1948, and so she could then also do a search through any public birth certificates and birth announcements at the time, as well as church records if she could get a hold of any, and even records of military drafts. But when all of this didn't provide any new leads, she focused on physical markers of Benjamin's body. He didn't wear a wedding ring, he had nothing distinctive like tattoos or piercings, and didn't even have any birthmarks that could aid the search. He did have multiple scars, like I said previously, that could all seemingly be explained, including 2 on his left elbow that he said he had a very strong suspicion had come about after he had fallen off of a loading dock in Indiana when he was younger. The bone in his elbow had been reinforced using 2 screws, but this procedure and the screws that were used during the procedure had all been too common to lead to anywhere. And when none of these aided the search, she decided to search for DNA relatives on any private databases. Obviously, the FBI had already attempted to find a DNA match for the man himself in their databases, but she decided the best route now was to search for any DNA relative matches suggesting an immediate relation. An ancestry service called 23andMe donated a testing kit for the search, and the results ultimately began building a family tree of distant genealogical relatives until she could kind of narrow it down to his biological parents. The results showed that he had a lot of DNA matches with the family name Powell, which didn't mean that this was necessarily his last name, but it means that there was a direct relation to that family name somewhere. She continued this search for over a year, and it finally seemed as though she was getting somewhere. But then, rather abruptly, Benjamin cut off all contact with her. There wasn't much discussion as to why this occurred. Fitzpatrick claimed it was because she suspected he didn't really want to find his old identity, while Benjamin had later publicly stated that it was actually because she had refused to give him access to his own ancestry information. And a decade after that first discovery, an identity was finally found. A number of DNA samples were taken from distant cousins in the Powell family tree, which could slowly narrow down the missing gaps in the ancestry. And then someone had noticed a mistake in the initial family tree, so one of the members had been misidentified. Once the correct relative was traced, they discovered this individual had actually passed away in Indiana. The investigators then began to search through yearbooks from around 1976 in Indiana, and finally the yearbook from the 1976 class of Jefferson High School in Lafayette, Indiana had it. A teenage photograph of the man they'd been searching for all those years with his real name printed underneath. William Burgess Powell, the son of Furman and Marjorie Powell, was born in Lafayette, Indiana. He sadly lost his father in the year of 1969 and his mother in 1996, but he had 2 living brothers, one in Florida and the other one in the family home in Lafayette. Benjamin, or William, had apparently been relatively correct about everything that he could recall. His remaining family were able to shed some enlightenment on his early life, and as it would turn out, William spent the majority of his life in Lafayette. He had had a number of different jobs in the local area, and he'd moved out of the family home when he was 25 into a mobile home just outside the area. The family that had actually owned the mobile home property were particularly close with him. They said that he'd spent the majority of his time alone, but he would make sure to eat dinner with this family every single night. And then one night in 1976 he failed to show up for dinner, and so they checked his trailer only to find all of his belongings in place but no sign of him. His car was then found abandoned a few days later a few miles away from the property, and his brother reported him as a missing person. He was found relatively quickly living in Boulder, Colorado, and working in the kitchen of a restaurant called Azar's. Now, at the time, the mystery man had actually had a very distinct memory of this restaurant, and he would consistently tell Catherine Slater that he just remembers how bad the food had been there, as well as this employment actually providing an explanation for his extensive knowledge on all things kitchen equipment related. Once his family had been informed of his discovery, they had made multiple attempts to contact him while he was living in Boulder, but he remained out of touch with them for years. And then one day, some years later, his brother had asked a friend of his working in an army intelligence service to run a search for his distant brother in hopes of him finding some way of contacting him. The results of this background check shocked him, as there was no record of William Powell whatsoever. It was as though he'd never even existed. And as years passed, as he didn't hear anything from William, his brother began to fear the worst. It's not exactly known why William disappeared that day in 1976 and why he failed to contact his family, and then what really happened past that point. A man named Chico Goetz had actually allegedly been his closest friend at the time, and they had impulsively decided one evening following a number of drinks that they would up and move to Boulder. William had just received a kind of small but relatively useful payment from a previous employer as a result of him slipping on ice on a loading dock that had caused him to break his left arm. The pair's last contact had been in 1977 after their move to Boulder, and he hadn't known what had happened to him since that point. What is known is that after leaving Boulder, he had worked in multiple restaurants between 1978 and 1983, but then following this point, there is no known employment or income records. Between this point and 2004, there was absolutely no record of William Powell. It seems unlikely that the exact details of what happened to him over those years will ever be known. Some people believe that he may have chosen to live in the woods in isolation like he'd initially said, or whether maybe something more sinister happened to him. It just seems as though we'll never know. And so that is everything I'm going to discuss today on the case of Benjamin Kyle or William Powell. So let me know your guys' thoughts on this. I just thought it was absolutely interesting. It was so interesting. Never really heard anything like this. Feel free to let me know your thoughts down below, as well as if you have any specific case requests. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you found this interesting, and I'll see you guys very soon for another video. Thanks for watching. Bye.